She had already pushed past the point where most people would have turned back. The canyon was silent in a way that felt almost deliberate, as if it were holding its breath and watching her. Every step she took echoed faintly against the stone, a reminder of how alone she was. The cold had been creeping into her bones for hours, settling deeper with each passing moment, dulling her fingers and tightening her chest. Firewood had become more than a necessity. It had become an obsession, a single solution to a problem that refused to go away. But the canyon offered nothing. No branches, no dry brush, nothing but rock and shadow. It was the wind that caught her attention first. Not the harsh, biting gusts she had been battling, but something softer, almost gentle. It slipped past her cheek like a whisper, warmer than the air around her. At first, she thought it was her imagination, a trick of a body pushed too far. But then it came again, steady and unmistakable, warmth, not enough to comfort her fully, but enough to stand out against the cold that had been her constant companion. She turned toward the canyon wall, tracing the source of the draft with slow, careful steps. Her hands brushed against the rough stone, searching feeling. There was a narrow opening, barely noticeable, unless someone was looking for it. It was nothing more than a crack at first glance, shadowed and uninviting. But the air flowing from it carried that same strange warmth. It wasn't strong, but it was real. Caution warred with desperation. The opening was tight, forcing her to turn sideways as she edged herself in. The rock pressed close around her, scraping against her clothes, stealing what little space she had to move. 30 feet is not far in ordinary circumstances, but in a confined space, it stretches into something far more daunting. Every inch forward required effort, patience, and a willingness to keep going, despite the uncertainty ahead. The deeper she moved, the more the air changed. It grew warmer, more consistent, wrapping around her like something alive. The cold that had gripped her began to loosen its hold, retreating slowly but surely. By the time she reached a wider pocket inside, she could feel the difference clearly. It wasn't just warmer. It was stable, protected. The kind of warmth that didn't rely on flames or fuel, but on something more constant, something embedded in the earth itself. She sat there for a long time, letting the realization settle in. The need for firewood, the endless search for something to burn, suddenly felt distant, almost irrelevant. The canyon, which had seemed so empty and unforgiving, had been hiding this quiet refuge all along. It wasn't obvious. It didn't announce itself. It required attention, persistence, and a willingness to notice something small and unusual. In that moment, survival shifted from struggle to adaptation. Instead of fighting the environment, she had found a way to work with it. The warmth in the rock wasn't dramatic or overwhelming, but it was enough. Enough to keep her alive, enough to give her rest, enough to remind her that solutions don't always come in the forms we expect. The moment she noticed the faint warm draft, it did not arrive as a dramatic revelation, but as something subtle, almost easy to dismiss. In a harsh environment like a canyon, where cold air settles heavily, and every surface seems to absorb and reflect that chill, warmth feels out of place. It is not something the mind expects, especially when the body is already adapted to discomfort and is focused on endurance. That is why such a small change can go unnoticed by many. The human brain, when pushed into survival mode, often narrows its focus to immediate and familiar solutions. In her case, that solution had been firewood, something tangible and reliable. Yet the canyon offered none, and the absence of it had begun to feel like a dead end. The warm draft disrupted that thinking in a quiet but powerful way. It was not strong enough to provide instant comfort, but it was distinct enough to stand apart from the surrounding air. This difference mattered. In survival situations, contrasts often carry meaning. A slight variation in temperature, a shift in wind direction, or a change in sound can all indicate something hidden beneath the surface. The draft suggested that the environment was not as uniform as it appeared. It hinted at movement, at space beyond what the eye could see, and most importantly, at a potential source of heat that did not rely on external fuel. What makes such a detail life-saving is not just its presence, but the decision to pay attention to it. Many people might have ignored it, attributing it to imagination or a temporary fluctuation in the wind. Exhaustion, fear, and cold can cloud judgment, making it easier to dismiss anything that does not fit into an expected pattern. However, her willingness to pause and acknowledge the difference allowed her to break out of a single-track mindset. Instead of continuing to search for firewood that did not exist, she began to consider an alternative explanation for the warmth she felt. This shift in attention reflects a deeper survival skill, the ability to observe without assumption. The canyon was not offering obvious signs of safety. There were no clear shelters, no visible resources, nothing that stood out as a solution. Yet the draft represented a subtle clue, one that required interpretation rather than immediate action. By recognizing it as something meaningful, she opened the door to a new possibility. It was no longer just a random sensation, but a signal pointing towards something hidden. The importance of such details becomes even clearer when considering how nature often conceals its resources. Warm air moving through rock can indicate geothermal activity, trapped heat, or an enclosed space protected from external conditions. These are not things that announce themselves openly. They must be discovered through careful observation and a willingness to explore the unknown. In this sense, the draft was more than just a physical phenomenon. It was a message from the environment, offering guidance to anyone perceptive enough to notice it. Her response to that message transformed her situation. Instead of remaining stuck in a cycle of searching and failing, she redirected her energy toward understanding the source of the warmth. This decision marked the beginning of a shift from passive suffering to active problem solving to angle. It demonstrated that survival is not only about strength or endurance, but also about awareness. The ability to detect and interpret small changes can make the difference between continuing a losing effort and finding a hidden advantage. Curiosity often feels like a quiet impulse, something easy to ignore when conditions are harsh and energy is limited. In her situation, it would have been entirely reasonable to dismiss that feeling and continue focusing on what she already believed was the solution. Her mind had been fixed on finding firewood, a familiar and dependable answer to the problem of cold. That kind of thinking is common in survival scenarios because it offers a sense of control. When everything else feels uncertain, people tend to cling to what they know. Yet curiosity has a way of interrupting that pattern, gently pushing against assumptions and asking whether something has been overlooked. The moment she felt the warm draft, curiosity became the bridge between noticing and acting. Awareness alone is not enough if it does not lead to exploration. Many people can sense that something is different, but without the willingness to investigate, that difference fades into the background. Her instinct told her that the warmth was not random, that it came from somewhere specific. Instead of brushing it aside, she allowed that instinct to guide her attention toward the canyon wall. This shift might seem small, but it marked a critical turning point. It redirected her focus from searching blindly to searching with purpose. As she moved closer, her awareness sharpened. The rough texture of the rock, the subtle flow of air, and the slight change in temperature all combined to form a clearer picture. She was no longer reacting to the environment, she was studying it. And this kind of observation requires a certain mental flexibility, the ability to pause and reassess, even when under stress. It shows a balance between instinct and reasoning, where a gut feeling is not blindly followed, but carefully examined. Her curiosity did not make her reckless, it made her attentive. Finding the narrow crack in the rock was not the result of luck alone. It came from this heightened awareness, from the decision to trust that the small details she noticed had meaning. The opening itself was easy to miss, blending into the natural lines and shadows of the canyon. Without curiosity, it would have remained invisible, just another part of the landscape. But by following the source of the draft, she was able to uncover something hidden in plain sight. This illustrates how often solutions are not absent, but simply unnoticed, waiting for someone to look a little closer. There is also an emotional aspect to curiosity that played a role in her actions. In difficult situations, fear can dominate decision-making, encouraging caution to the point of inaction. The narrow opening in the rock was not inviting. It was dark, confined, and uncertain. Entering it meant stepping into the unknown, leaving behind the relative openness of the canyon for a space that could have posed its own risks. Curiosity, however, can counterbalance fear by offering a sense of possibility. It suggests that there might be something worth discovering, something that could change the situation for the better. Her instinct worked alongside this curiosity, providing a subtle sense of direction. Instinct is shaped by experience and perception, often operating below the level of conscious thought. It can recognize patterns and signals that the mind has not fully processed. When she followed the warmth, she was not just acting on a random impulse, but on a combination of sensory input and internal judgment. This partnership between curiosity and instinct allowed her to move forward with a degree of confidence, even without knowing exactly what she would find. The act of investigating the crack was more than a physical movement. It was a mental shift. It represented a willingness to break away from a fixed idea and explore alternatives. In survival, this flexibility can be just as important as strength or endurance. Environments are unpredictable, and solutions rarely present themselves in expected forms. By staying open to new information and following her curiosity, she positioned herself to discover something that others might have missed. Fear has a way of tightening everything: the body, the breath, the thoughts. When she stood at the narrow opening in the rock, that tightening must have been immediate and unavoidable. The space ahead was dark and constricted, offering no clear promise of safety. It challenged a basic human instinct, the desire for open space, visibility, and control. Stepping into a confined passage like that means giving up all three at once. There is no easy retreat, no clear view of what lies ahead, and very little room to react if something goes wrong. In that moment, hesitation would have been the most natural response. What made the difference was her decision to move forward despite that hesitation. Courage in this context was not a bold or dramatic act, but a quiet choice repeated with each inch of progress. She had to turn her body sideways, pressing against the rock as she edged into the crack. The stone scraped against her clothing and skin, a constant reminder of how little space she had. Every movement required care. There was no room for sudden motions or mistakes. The environment forced her to slow down, to focus completely on the act of moving forward. 30 feet might not seem like much in the open, but in a tight, enclosed space, it becomes something else entirely. Distance stretches when progress is measured in inches. Time feels different too, each second expanding as the mind tracks every sensation, every sound, every shift and balance. The darkness ahead would have felt heavier with each step, the uncertainty growing rather than fading. She could not see the end clearly, which meant she had to trust that there was one. That kind of trust is not easy to maintain when discomfort and fear are constantly reinforcing the idea that turning back would be safer. Persistence became her anchor. Instead of letting fear dictate her actions, she focused on the small, immediate task in front of her. Move one foot then the other, shift her weight carefully. Keep breathing steadily. By breaking the challenge into manageable pieces, she prevented it from becoming overwhelming. This approach is often what allows people to endure difficult situations. Rather than confronting the full scope of the problem at once, they narrow their attention to what can be controlled in the present moment. There was also an element of commitment in her actions. Once she had moved a certain distance into the crack, turning back would not necessarily have been easier than continuing forward. The confined space limited her options, making retreat just as difficult as progress. This reality can intensify fear, but it can also strengthen resolve. When the path behind is no simpler than the path ahead, the mind begins to shift toward completion rather than escape. She had already taken the risk of entering, and that risk demanded follow through. The physical discomfort added another layer to the challenge. The rock pressing in from both sides, the lack of space to fully extend her body, and the constant friction would have tested her endurance. Discomfort has a way of amplifying doubt, making every movement feel more difficult than it actually is. Yet she continued, not because the situation became easier, but because she chose not to let those sensations stop her. This distinction is important. Persistence does not remove difficulty. It allows progress in spite of it. As she moved deeper, the warmth that had drawn her in likely became more noticeable. That subtle change in temperature served as a form of reassurance, a sign that her decision might lead to something worthwhile. It did not eliminate the risk, but it provided enough encouragement to keep going. Small positive signals can have a powerful effect in difficult situations, reinforcing the belief that effort is not being wasted. When she finally reached the interior space, the change was not sudden in a dramatic sense, but it was undeniable. The tight pressure of the narrow passage gave way to a small pocket where she could move more freely. And with that physical relief came a deeper realization. The air around her held a steady warmth, not the fleeting kind carried by shifting wind, but something consistent and reliable. It surrounded her rather than passing by, settling into the space as if it belonged there. After hours of exposure to cold, this difference would have felt almost unreal, like stepping into a hidden layer of the canyon that operated by its own rules. What made this discovery so powerful was not just the presence of warmth, but its source. There was no fire, no burning material, no visible mechanism creating heat in the way she might have expected. Instead, the warmth seemed to come from the rock itself, stored and released in a way that required no effort on her part. This challenged the assumption she had been operating under. That survival depended on gathering and maintaining external resources like firewood. In this space, the environment itself provided what she needed without requiring constant attention or replenishment. This kind of natural shelter offers a different kind of security. Fire, while effective, demands ongoing work. It must be built, fed, and protected. It can fail if materials run out or conditions change. The warmth she found inside the rock, however, was stable. It did not flicker or fade with time. It did not depend on her energy or the availability of fuel. That stability is what transformed it from a simple comfort into a true solution. It allowed her to rest without the constant pressure of maintaining her heat source, something that is crucial in any survival situation. The space itself likely contributed to this effect as well. Being enclosed within the rock meant protection from wind, which is one of the primary ways cold air strips heat from the body. Without that constant exposure, her body could begin to recover, holding onto the warmth rather than losing it as quickly as before. The combination of insulated surroundings and naturally warm air created an environment where survival was no longer a continuous struggle, but something sustainable. It turned a hostile landscape into a place where she could endure for longer periods. Key. There is also a deeper lesson in how this shelter was found. It was not obvious or easily accessible. From the outside, the canyon appeared barren and unforgiving, offering no clear signs of safety. The warmth was hidden behind a narrow, uninviting opening that many would have ignored or avoided. This highlights how nature often conceals its most valuable resources, requiring effort and perception to uncover them. The shelter was always there, but it only became useful once she recognized and reached it. Her discovery also shifted her relationship with the environment. Instead of viewing the canyon as an enemy to be endured, she began to see it as something that could provide, even if in unexpected ways. This shift in perspective is important because it changes how a person interacts with their surroundings. When the environment is seen only as a threat, actions tend to be reactive and limited. When it is seen as a potential source of support, even in small ways, it opens the door to more creative and effective solutions. The absence of a need for firewood marked a significant turning point. What had been her primary concern, the constant search for something to burn, was no longer necessary. This freed up both her physical energy and mental focus. Instead of spending time and effort on a task that the canyon could not support, she could now concentrate on rest, planning, and conserving her strength. In survival, conserving energy is often just as important as finding resources. And this shelter allowed her to do both. At the beginning of her struggle, everything about her approach was driven by resistance. The cold was something to fight, the canyon something to endure, and survival something that depended on forcing a solution into a place that did not easily provide one. Her focus on firewood reflected this mindset. It was a familiar answer, something she understood and could control, but it did not match the reality of her surroundings. The canyon was not a forest, and expecting it to behave like one created a constant sense of frustration and limitation. Each failed attempt to find fuel reinforced the idea that she was trapped in an environment that offered nothing. The shift began when she allowed herself to notice what was actually there instead of what she wished was there. The faint, warm draft was not part of her original plan, but it represented an opportunity to rethink her situation. Instead of continuing to push against the environment, she started to listen to it, to interpret its signals rather than ignore them. This is where adaptation takes root. It requires letting go of rigid expectations and becoming responsive to what is real, even if it is unfamiliar or subtle. Her decision to explore the source of the warmth marked the transition from resistance to cooperation. Rather than imposing a solution, she followed a clue provided by the canyon itself. This change in approach did not make the situation instantly easy, but it made it workable. By aligning her actions with the conditions around her, she reduced the amount of effort needed to achieve the same goal. Instead of expending energy searching for firewood that did not exist, she invested it in understanding and using what was available. Inside the warm space, this shift became fully realized. The need to fight the cold diminished because she was no longer exposed to it in the same way. The environment, which had once seemed like an obstacle, became a source of support. This transformation highlights a key aspect of adaptation. It is not about eliminating challenges entirely, but about changing how those challenges are approached. The cold outside still existed, but by positioning herself within a naturally insulated and warmer area, she reduced its impact to a manageable level. This change in mindset also affected her mental state. Constant struggle can drain not only physical energy, but also clarity and hope. When every action feels like it leads nowhere, it becomes harder to think creatively or notice new possibilities. By adapting, she broke that cycle. The discovery of the warm space provided not just physical relief, but a sense of progress, a reminder that solutions were possible. This renewed perspective likely made her more attentive, more open to further observations, and better equipped to handle whatever came next. Adaptation often involves a degree of humility, the recognition that one's initial assumptions may not be correct. In her case, it meant accepting that the solution was not something she could build or carry, but something she needed to find and use. This required trust in the environment, or at least a willingness to engage with it differently. Instead of seeing the canyon as something to conquer, she began to see it as something to navigate, with its own patterns and hidden advantages. Another important aspect of this shift is efficiency. Survival is as much about conserving energy as it is about acquiring resources. By adapting to the natural warmth of the canyon, she eliminated the need for continuous effort to maintain a fire. This allowed her to rest, recover, and preserve her strength for other tasks. It turned a draining situation into a sustainable one, where her energy could be managed rather than constantly depleted.